I'm here with Liz Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, who are, what are you? You're the, what did John Mack call you?
Of the mythopoetic radar team.
There you go.
Yeah,
And
we've been called other things too.
they've written the most amazing essay, and they're going to build on this. But it is currently posted in a few places. I'll post it also. It's at the Vineyard of the Soccer, TheSaker.com, one of my favorite blogs. And it charts the very unlikely history of the Neocon movement in the United States in the person of somebody who I'd never heard of in my life. His name is James Burnham, and he was Trotsky's assistant for a while. And then he came back and landed straight in the heart of the far-right military intelligence establishment. And really his philosophy became neoconservatism. I mean, there are many godfathers of it, but probably no one more so than him. And in fact, as you point out, you just learn such incredible things in this article. Orwell's 1984 was very much based on this James Burnham's vision of control. And anyway, so basically the direction that you're going in begins with this very unlikely origin of neoconservatism and propaganda, war propaganda. The ideology of neoconservatism is endless war. And I want you to flesh out really the difference between this as an ideology and almost like a cult or almost like a religion versus just plain old war profiteering, greed and war profiteering, and like what distinguishes this from that. So that's one thing. And then next, what we're going to get into is how, this propaganda is escalating to the point where it really is going to be, about taking over the ultimate battlefield, which is the mind and one's dreams, the dream world, everyone's dream world, everyone's dreams. So, where would you like to begin? Where do we begin? So, okay, what distinguishes? Okay, what distinguishes this sort of illogical? Because it was pointed out, like for example, the Vietnam War was a test case of this neoconservative theory, and it failed. And then they went ahead and did it again in Iraq. It failed again. We're about to do it again. They're saber rattling, the Neocons saber rattling with the Russians. They're doing it again. It's failed repeatedly. It's a non-viable, completely illogical philosophy. Right. It does not work. What is the point? And what is the difference between this ideology and just plain old greed and war profiteering?
Well, it's a means to an end, I suppose. As you said, it's ideological. This is an ideological response. They are what they are referred to as true believers. They believe in their own self-righteousness. They believe that they are carrying God's sword with them, and they are going to continue to do that until the end of time, quite literally. And so, I mean, we've traced it back. When we met you, I think we were doing the whole Crusades thing, the medieval thing, right. The origin of the Fitzgerald family and their involvement with the the colonization of Britain and the colonization of Ireland in the 11th and 12th and 13th century, all of those things. And there's an enormous history. It's all very personal. There's a handful of families that have been doing it all along, and the Jews are very much involved in it. And the fact is that, we got some comments, quite a few comments actually about James Burnham. James Burnham was was English. He was an American, but he was the child of English parents. He'd come here. He was educated at Princeton, and then went to Oxford. He actually he took a course with J.R.R. Tolkien in terms of understanding Anglo-Saxon history. He wanted to learn how to speak Anglo-Saxon, so he took the course with J.R.R. Tolkien. So, and then he comes to New York and winds up, he comes from this very ultra right-wing, very illiberal place in Oxford and Balliol College, and then gets involved at NYU with some of the Trotskyite they're leftists, but they're not really, they're anti-Soviet. There's this huge problem going on between between the Trotskyites, the followers of Trotsky, and the followers of Stalin, with the existing Communist Party, both in the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. And after Lenin's death, there was an enormous power struggle, and they had to come up. There was also a philosophical power struggle, and that's probably what we're still dealing with today. This whole delineation between what was left and what was right, what's the middle. I mean, we have all these definitions today of neoliberal and neoconservative versus center right versus center left, and it's so muddy at this point. It's really none of it's mostly meaningless.
Absolutely, it's certainly in the United States. We've gotten to the point. It's absolutely. It seems like the work of Burnham has been a smashing success because we've arrived at a point now where the left is acting like Phyllis Schlafly or something. It's just, it's bizarre.
Actually, that's a good opportunity I really wanted to let your audience know really how we really entered into this originally was, we were actually working on a documentary about the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty back in the 1970s. And this was right at the time when the Vietnam War had really proven to be a catastrophe, when there was a recognition, and that's how Jimmy Carter became president. It was all based on the idea that we needed détente because we needed to reinvest in the American economy because the Vietnam War had already devastated Main Street at that point. So we were following up with this documentary about the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union crosses the border into Afghanistan, and détente is over. The idea of negotiation is over. Everybody who is in any capacity in Washington that is in trying to work with the Soviets basically is leaving town practically. And we witnessed it. It all happened almost overnight. So that was kind of our initiation into what we now know was the world of James Burnham. Actually, that was thriving at that point. And even with the catastrophe, as you pointed out, with Vietnam, what the Soviet invasion did was it totally reinvigorated, without any problem at all, the idea that they could move on to the next war. Okay?
And then ironically, that happened under Carter.
Well, actually, it was delivered right to Reagan's door. In fact, it's very interesting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor, although Carter lost him partly due to the shenanigans of the Reagan administration cutting a deal with Iran and things like that, Brzezinski was invited to come into the Reagan administration. And we would have to say, if there is a single individual who took the power of Burnham and actually implemented that power to effect for the next 50 years, or however many years it's been at this moment, the ability of the neocon agenda to basically stay on course without having to look back at all. And as you said, it has little to do with this idea of success as we would think of it. When we think of winning a war, we assume it means some kind of the war results in a country that now we have some authority over, and somehow it's going to benefit us. We don't think of it in terms of destroying basically a country and leaving it in a completely destroyed state as a win. But we may have to rethink some of these ideas from a neocon perspective, that some of this kind of thinking is actually part of it. And when you look at the role that Afghanistan did play in terms of the British Empire and its desire to control Eurasia, which really goes back to the 19th century goals, and a lot of what the neocon agenda really is about is fulfilling those 19th century goals, which is to control Eurasia, which means controlling Russia. And that's where we are with it right now.
Right. So how, so how does it, so it's not really it's really about controlling Russia. That's the credo. It's not really game theory. It's not really about war profiteering. It's
Well, that's a level of it. There's no
Mhm.
question. You have people with different motivations, but if you really got into the ones who are carrying this with a kind of mission, you have to look at Berman, you have to look at Brzezinski, and you have to, see that they don't have a problem with the war profiteering as an outcome of this, but they personally are not really there for that reason, and they're far more dangerous, believe me, than the war profiteers are. Because without them, the war profiteers wouldn't have a war.
They wouldn't have anything to hang on.
Exactly.
There was a school of thought called geopolitics that came about at the turn of the 20th century. And I'm sure your audience has heard, and you've heard of Halford Mackinder.
No, I have not. Actually.
Halford Mackinder he is the godfather of this thing called geopolitics.
Okay.
And there were a number of others during that time period. Karl Haushofer, who advised Adolf Hitler about controlling geography, geopolitics. In this view, it's a very materialistic political view. It's like if you own that territory and you control the resources on that particular territory, in this particular case, Eurasia, and then you control the access to pipelines, you control the oil, you control the timber, you control the vast riches of this place, the Siberia, as well as the transit route from east to west, from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. So this is what they came about at during World War I. You had a lot of very disillusioned intellectuals who thought that prior to World War I that the world was coming together based on commerce, based on trade. And World War I proved that the whole thing could fall down into a catastrophic, destructive force for Western civilization. There's a terror of the failure of Western civilization to actually deal with the reality. So this school of thought basically has taken on a very, very aggressive position. Their objective is that they have to cobble together politically the various countries of Europe to the point where they can align themselves against Russia. And of course, you had this situation in World War I where Germany was against Russia. And once again, Russia was the prize in this. They failed to accomplish that. So what they've been working on ever since is a way in which there were various generations. The first, as I mentioned, James Burnham was the second generation of these guys. In the 1930s and 40s, who took Spikeman's and Mackinder's ideas and with the new weapons that they had and said, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to develop an offensive capability that will enable us to control Western Europe as well as control Ukraine, and whoever controls Ukraine will basically have the stepping stone to take over Eurasia completely. So the policy that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years in Ukraine and especially Syria. Syria is pivotal to the control of Eurasia coming from the south, and Ukraine is pivotal for control of Eurasia coming from the west. So these are the things that we're dealing with politically right now, and nobody really involves this. Nobody's being told that. These things were set out and planned around the end of World War I. So we're talking about 100 years worth of policies that have been matured, and that's what they're doing right now. That's what Brzezinski represents. That's what Brzezinski is a protege of. Brzezinski is a protege of Paul Nitze and a protege of Burnham, and all of these. And Burnham was a protege of Mackinder, and so they followed along from generation to generation to generation to the point where they can't even explain what it is they're doing any longer. I mean, we used to get. I used to go mad when I'd hear some of the speeches that this guy, Ben Rhodes, would cook up for Obama to make. I mean, it was like making a hash out of history. He'd pull a little bit of the just war doctrine out of this, and he'd pull a little bit about when it's right to use nuclear weapons and limited nuclear weapons and force. But in the end, we want to we don't, just like Jimmy Carter said in his inauguration speech, we want to see a world that's absolutely free of nuclear weapons. But what they don't say is that in that the United States and Britain basically want to control the world
and get to keep their weapons.
and get to keep their
Right.
weapons.
But I think this is an opportunity to, really go back though to the Brzezinski key, because again, this whole door opened when Brzezinski was successful at tricking the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan. What he really established at that point was the Neocons' dream come true. They had the opportunity at that point to activate at a level they never had before. And this again is where we explain in the series. You get into the British connection. You get into Brian Crozier, who was basically very involved as a British agent and working with the Americans on establishing the anti-Soviet propaganda worldwide, basically. So once the Soviets crossed the border, this kind of gave a lot of programs that were being developed in the 70s, especially, to actually have a gravitas and an ease with which they could be spread all over the world. And that's where you get the propaganda campaign that really has, now it's actually so out of control, as we've talked about, where the idea of proof is literally not necessary ever.
Americans have to come to realize, and realize pretty quickly, that this is really an Anglo-American effort. The brains of this, I mean, when we see some of the crazy things that come out of Washington, it's because it's brainless. Okay, the brain is in London, and has been in London, for the last 450 years.
This is a great opportunity to let people know how much it's controlled by the British. Cecil Rhodes, in his will, stated that there was a need to create the secret societies and the idea of basically making sure that all the colonies of the British Empire have a connection to Britain through the schooling, through the secret societies, through the scholarships. You get a Rhodes Scholarship, you're really getting an indoctrination into British thinking. And that's what people need to realize. So when they look at someone like Bill Clinton or Rachel Maddow and they see them getting these scholarships, instead of just thinking of them as brilliant, they also have to realize that they become, if they begin to see the world less as an American at some level and more as a British citizen would. And that's, of course, part of the challenge that Americans have in understanding, especially when we get into the cultural Cold War, which was, Burnham's initiation, really, post-World War II, was in helping to establish the CIA's intelligence operation to control the American left through the cultural Cold War, which really involved far more than journalism. It basically involved, the entire cultural scene.
Oh, so, absolutely. You talked about the Congress for Cultural Freedom and its role in co-opting artists and teachers, people from all strata of society, but especially the ones that are going to interface and influence a large amount of people. And we really see this, the new version, the way it's come back is the fake news narrative, and it always goes back to Russia, of course. And then of course cultural freedom. I mean, it's really become a joke. Whenever the United States calls anything freedom, it's just, from freedom fries to Operation Iraqi Freedom. I mean, freedom has just become a really bad word. It's like maybe they're trying to unsell us on the whole idea. Maybe I don't know.
We were in the Soviet Union in 1987. We'd gone there with a bunch of American filmmakers from the West Coast to see whether they could put together some kind of collaborative effort. So Gorbachev had been in there for about a year, and our guide said to us at one point, she was one of Boris Yeltsin's assistants. She said, what is it about Americans? She said, we get people visiting the Soviet Union from all over the world. We get them from third world dictatorships. We get them from republics. We get them from South America. We get them from China. We get them from Africa. She said, the only people who come here who tell us they're absolutely free are the Americans. And she said, as far as we can tell, you are the most conformist group of people I've ever seen. And that was true. We have been so indoctrinated since the 1950s over this idea about freedom, that it's a concept, as you said, freedom fries, freedom this, freedom that. you know, and the fact is that nobody really, even no American anyway, really knows what it is. And it was very interesting to see because we had studied the Soviet Union a lot, we had been there previously, and we'd had interactions in Afghanistan with Russians, and so we'd been back and forth quite a bit over the years, and then throughout the beginning of the late 70s and early 1980s, and to see these West Coast people try to come to grips with what the Soviet Union really was and how they did things there, there was just such a disconnect between they were trying certainly very hard to understand the way the Russians behaved and the way the Russians did things. But there just simply was no idea that somebody could do anything any differently than we did here in the United States. It wasn't that they didn't want to understand it, they couldn't understand it.
But you see, that really is the direct result, again, of the effect of this cultural Cold War had on the educational system.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the whole way that the American view of the world was really framed. I think this is what's really stunning people about our series. When they look at how long-standing this intentional operation was to create a total propagandized view of what the Soviet Union was, what its intentions were, what it was doing, and put out absolutely at a constant level false information intentionally. And again, I think people need to realize the word propaganda basically should be called lying. It's called making up stuff for political purposes. So propaganda, if they use the term propaganda, I think a lot of Americans, when they hear the word propaganda and that we use it, think, well, that's okay because we're the good guys. That's how effective this educational process has been on a lot of Americans.
Well, after all, our propaganda is true. Theirs is false.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I mean, you get that kind of response.
But this is why, again, going back to what Brzezinski was able to accomplish was not just tricking the Soviets into Afghanistan to establish the greatest propaganda story that ever had happened. This was the greatest CIA adventure in propaganda. But Brzezinski actually boasted in 1998 that he, in fact, did it. He went public with this information, has never denied it. In fact, he has actually reaffirmed it. So here you have the guy that intentionally tricked the Soviets in, that did things and used the power of the state, the power of the state to use with propaganda, with financing the mujahideen and the Islamic fundamentalists to go in and destabilize the region and all of that, to intentionally set out stories so that the Soviets would get so freaked out at some point and do what they actually did, which was to go into Afghanistan believing there was going to be a massive insurrection on their southern border if they didn't do it. And once it happened, the whole operation went, into one orbit, and it's been in that orbit ever since. Even though there is Brzezinski's boasting about it, even though there is tremendous amount of background information, and again, we're trying to put all of this information, again, in the series. And by the way, I do want to mention it is on our website at invisiblehistory.com, because I'm not sure that it would be easy to find on TheSaker's website. I don't think it's up at this point there now. So, but
it is. Well, I mean, maybe I haven't closed the tab. I've just finished reading it, so.
On
that side.
On that website?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't realize that.
I mean, it could be that if I try to if I refresh the page, it might be gone. I don't know.
I believe that was what I
don't
anyway,
think they would take it down. I think it would just maybe move down.
Yeah, it's moved someplace else.
Yeah.
Right, but it may not be as easy to find when when it was on the front page. Let's put it that way. So, but anyway, the point I'm trying to really make here is in tying together for people how the framing of reality was intentionally created. And that is one of the most difficult things for a lot of Americans to really accept. And it's like a dissonance, that you can't believe that this was intentionally done.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what our series is laying out. But when you get it to the point where you realize it wasn't actually just an American agenda, that the British attitude and the British involvement in helping to establish this played a very significant role. You realize that the whole nature of geopolitics is not just about the United States. And you have to go back hundreds of years at least. especially into the history of the British and its attitude towards Russia, you begin to understand how long-lived and how complicated it is to really begin to understand the nature of the people who are playing what's referred to as the great game. I mean, this is really what it's about. It's the final stage of the great game, which originally was the battle between the British Empire and the Tsarist Russia in competition in the region of Central Asia that was going on in the 19th century. And that's what we're now seeing the final end of. And the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan probably had more to do with the British agenda from the 19th century, the unfinished business of the British.
It's not over by any means, by the way.
Oh, no, not at all.
It's also part of, I don't know, like 18 other Operation Freedom Sentinel, this, that, and the other. I mean, that's what it's been renamed. It was, forgot it was Operation Freedom something, and now it's Freedom Sentinel, whatever.
Well, yeah, the Bush administration had the Freedom Agenda, I believe, is what it was.
They hate us for our freedom. I don't blame them.
Yes. They hate us for our freedom. And those French fries are not French, they're freedom fries.
Right.
Yeah, so it really, if you actually look at it seriously, it is ridiculous. It's absurd, but this is what passes for American foreign policy. As I said, it looks crazy. But the fact is that this has been going on. We're reliving right now on the front pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine. We are reliving the 19th century British-Russian competition for control of Eurasia.
You know, another very unlikely place that people might not, some people do because they find it very offensive, but, people like me who were raised in very liberal milieus is in late night comedy. It's really gotten to a very strange place right now with Stephen Colbert, Trevor Noah, Saturday Night Live. I mean, most of these writers are handpicked from the Harvard Lampoon, where they were trained. They only got to be on the Lampoon if they did the right kind of ideological comedy. And so it's. I mean, I've seen it from the inside. I knew many people who created many of the most influential comedy shows in the United States, and they really all came from the Harvard Lampoon. Period. It was almost like a mafia. You couldn't even get into that business. It's loosened up someone, but I think it's very interesting to use a person like Trevor Noah, who is like Obama. He's half African and half. He's completely South African as far as being born there, but he's half white and half South African. But again, I think it's sort of bringing us back to some kind of they're not part of the Commonwealth, because of the Boers. The English did try to take over. It didn't work, I guess. But it's kind of that idea of he's one of us. He's part of that Anglo-American.
Well, yeah. I mean, Trump actually did bring that up shortly after he was elected, after he got into the White House with Nigel, what's his name?
Farage.
Yeah, Farage. He brought that up about proposing that the United States join the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
Instead of kind of get out of the United Nations and rejoin the Commonwealth. And, what does the United States need to be involved with Europe at all for? Because our origins are with our shared values are with the British Empire.
I think that in terms of shared values, I do think Americans really need to take in the fact that when you're looking at PBS, you're looking at the BBC at a level of influence. And what is also interesting is the fact that whenever they talk about the influence, let's say, of Russia Today, they always make the comment, well, it's a state-run news service. And obviously, that's propaganda. Nobody ever says that about the BBC.
Right.
Nobody ever mentions the fact that that is also state-run. And so you can see that there is a standard that literally is just pulled out, whipped out, and it applies only to people that aren't our friend. So, whether it's dictatorships that we think are fine, because they're our friend, whatever, like the Saudis, let's say, in terms of, human rights and women's rights and all of that, when they're your friend, that's fine. But this idea that, again, when you mention, let's say, the lampoon being the basis on which even comedy, this again is all part of the cultural Cold War effect. And even though it may no longer just be the lampoon people that get in, the effect is still very much in place. Schools of journalism are clearly educating journalists into a way of thinking. You do not get the jobs at the top level of the mainstream media unless you know how to cut the story, unless you know how to frame it. You're just not going to get those big jobs.
Absolutely.
And so we know that whole process is still very much in place. But I think what's finally happening now is that it's simply becoming more visible. Where the emperor has no clothes, whatever those metaphors are that that seem to suggest that this misuse of the platforms is simply becoming more noticeable. When we first got involved with the Afghanistan story, there was still a belief, I'm sure, in most people that CBS News and ABC News and NBC News, they may periodically put out a story that somebody criticizes, and sometimes they used to claim, oh, they're really left-leaning. I always love that one. But basically, they were viewed as holding the standard bearers for freedom of the press.
Well, certainly in comparison to the 1950s, where these newsreels that played before the movies and the news, television didn't really develop right until the late 50s and early 60s.
True, but
it used to be so right-wing propagandistic, and I guess that with the failure of the Vietnam War, the right failed, and they had to find a way to co-opt the left, like you explained so well.
That's the point, though, about what was going on with the whole story about Afghanistan was total propaganda. Mm-hmm. That's exactly our point. That was what we were up against, was a total propagandized story that was being put out from the moment the Soviets crossed the border. It was completely orchestrated and ready to go, and it basically had all the right language in place. This is the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. President Carter, announced to the public. This is the man who basically signed the secret document allowing Brzezinski, 6 months before the Soviet invasion, to activate programs in order to lure them into Afghanistan. So the orchestration of propaganda was very well in place. I think what was not noticeable back then, that's much more noticeable now, is that it wasn't in every case propaganda. Not every story was as propagandized as we're seeing now. Now you've got, propaganda coming out in the fracking stories and, in stories that deal with all kinds of issues that are in any way controversial. Immunization, you've got journalists who have basically been run out of town in the mainstream media because they raised the question about people's concerns about immunization problems. So things like that now are more visible. Back then, you didn't have that kind of obvious.
And it's very overt. I mean, we have a woman here in Boston who is a longtime reporter, a community reporter, very well respected. And she got a job at, I think it was NPR. And she left the TV station. It was a commercial television station, and she got a job at NPR here locally in Boston. And she raised the issue of this, of the safety of the vaccines. And immediately she was
run out of town.
She was run out of town. She was no longer offered the job at NPR. She was far too off the agenda. And when you see it, I mean, that's just one instance of it, but it happens all the time.
So tell me about it. I've been churning out 2 articles every day for years now, and it's gotten to the point now, really, in the past couple of weeks, with the Seth Rich story, where I've hit the wall. I think the whole internet has hit the wall because you have the official narrative, and then you have these disaffected people who really, it's gotten to the point where I think many Americans sense that they're in a totalitarian regime as far as information is concerned, as far as the mainstream media is concerned, where they literally doubt everything, so that you then have crazy things coming out like the flat Earth theory. You know, you have serious people who are serious, like they think everything that NASA's done is absolutely fake, that the Earth is not a globe, the Earth is really flat, because they're just so disaffected. Or maybe that even might be a psychological operation where they're trying to test like how bad people's science education has been, and if they can, how far they can get over with this particular meme of a flat Earth, you know. But there are so many things like that. I mean, you know, everything is a false flag, you know, now. I mean, literally, I don't know. I don't know if what just happened in Manchester is real. You know, having lived half a block away from the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened, you know, I knew from when I was 6 years old that there was, you know, NORAD was supposed to blow things out of the sky before anything like that could happen. You know, where you could have a whole hour elapse with 4 planes being hijacked. I mean, right there, the story fell apart for me right there, you know. So,
well, I was in Afghanistan in 1981, 1983, covering the war there. Liz was there in 83 with me. I had a news crew. We were going around from city to city. We were talking to people about what was happening there under the Soviet occupation. We were restricted. There was no question about that. Where we could travel, a lot of it was very dangerous. There were raids all the time in various places. We'd get up. We were supposed to go off to a city or a village in one morning, and then we'd be waiting and waiting and waiting, and they'd say, no, we can't go. They'd be on the phone. You know, we can't get you there safely, that kind of thing. So, but I would get back to the United States, and I would read these articles that had, you know, clippings about things that had happened in Afghanistan while I was there, things that had happened in Kabul, in the area that I was in, and it was a complete fabrication of what really was going on. And the same thing happened with Roger Fisher from Harvard Law School. When we brought him to Afghanistan in 1983 to see if he could help negotiate the Russians out of Afghanistan, and we did a nightline, and they invited some people from Freedom House over to.
Freedom House, right?
To debate with us, and we were basically told that, I mean, at one point this so-called Mujahideen raised the issue about the fact that that Mujahideen completely took over control of the streets of Kabul at night, and Roger Fisher stood there and said, I can't claim I was everywhere all the time. But, you know, we were driving around until curfew at 9 o'clock at night, and, you know, there was no sign of any insurrection whatsoever. The government had firm control of the roads, and did have firm control of the roads. But that was the meme that was coming out of the major media from the very beginning, was that the Afghans weren't fighting their own war. The Russians were doing it. The Russians are committing atrocities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This went on and on and on. And what happened was, of course, that the Afghan government actually lasted longer than the Soviet Union. They did try, the Mujahideen did try a few major offenses from Pakistan over the Pakistani border, and failed.
But, you know, this really does tie back to our point about the propaganda level that was really created post-World War II, and that the Cultural Cold War and the whole activation of that kind of project, and the eventual merger, though, an active merger between the British agenda through the Brian Crozier, and, you know, this was where we get into the event that happened when the Soviets crossed the border, which really opened the floodgate for the propaganda then to just ooze out so easily. They didn't have to prove anything ever again. That's kind of what happened. We've been living in that insane state ever since.
This Russian hacking is just like the latest. I mean, it's so nonsensical, and it doesn't stop. It won't stop. There's no proof, and they keep saying it, and they keep saying it, and they keep saying it. It's absolutely absurd. So what's next? I mean, so, you know, we're just being bombarded with propaganda now. You talk about Robert Moss being an acolyte of these guys, and
perfect opportunity, actually, to, you know, you said, what's next, okay? Yeah. That's what's so interesting about tracking. One of the high-level agents that was working with Brian Crozier. I think Robert Moss was an Australian. He did relocate to the United States I think in the late 1980s, I believe. And that's when he shifted from being a high-level agent who was involved in overthrowing governments and in creating all this propaganda for years and years. And he became a dream coach. And he started writing books about dreaming.
Coach.
A dream coach. And if you go and Google the name Robert Moss Dream, you will discover a man who is world-renowned, who is invited to the highest level conferences all over the world to obviously have a following of people who go to him for teaching him for being taught how to dream, joint dreaming, and other things like that.
It's in this
but
kind
I
of
don't think a lot of
New Age kind of.
Well,
framework.
It's interesting. Yes, it is, of course.
Which, by the way, was a CIA project.
Yeah.
Aquarius.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, if you go online and Google around, you can see people who've been in his courses, and when they do find out that he was this high-level agent, they say, "Oh, that's impossible. What are you talking about?" Or other people who seem to say, "Well, he is an unusual coach, and the way he approached me, I really wasn't comfortable with him." So you can see that it has stirred some issues with people. But if you go to his website, not one mention of that at all in terms of his background. So the idea that he's the only one is another thing to consider, that this is all part of the movement of taking over these various realms. So when we talk about the Cultural Cold War in terms of academics and in terms of the journalism and playwrights and artists, we now have to include something called the multidimensional. And dreaming is not something that most people think of as a geopolitical quality. But when you realize that there's a term called mystical imperialism. It was coined for Cecil Rhodes. It was coined to express the desire of an individual, the power of the state behind it. And the power they're talking about is called mystical, that empire building is considered the power of God effectively. And if people don't like the word God, then, it's the power, it's the willfulness to use whatever you feel you have in order to advance your cause. And that, of course, in empire's case, is to take over other people's lands and resources and control them. And so this term, clearly is hinting at a quality that we believe that a man like Robert Moss is definitely working that channel now. So what is he doing it for? Well, this is all part of what our experience really connected to when we originally left analyzing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan through the geopolitical world and the fact-based world that we discovered didn't seem to really affect the narrative that we kept coming up against, and why we ended up going into writing screenplays and eventually writing The Voice, which really was expressing our realization that there was some other quality here that was affecting the geopolitics. And when you connect the quality of the mystical, which really dreaming is actually a mystical quality. It's an aspect of the power that is a part of creation itself. We now know when we talk about the quantum world, there is a deeper appreciation of the fact that when you get into a realm where the nature of the material world simply no longer functions the way it does in the visible world,
right.
You begin
There's
to realize
there are other dimensions.
Exactly. So as you get
and
right,
sort of informing the physical.
Right. As you get deeper into though the nature of the dream itself, and realize that it is a realm, and it does have something to do with the power of empires. And there's a reason that the Old Testament was basically a war manual, and that your job as as a devotee of Yahweh was to please Yahweh, so you win your war. Okay, and that was the whole point about the origin of these ideas. So we're looking at, in the form of Robert Moss, we feel a hint of a very important realm that is very much recognized as a part of the power of empire, and that that there are many, many, many probably individuals like him who are throughout the whole system. And when it comes to the New Age movement, people would almost laugh at that. Say, "Oh, that's silly." Well, that's a very convenient way for people to be distracted from what may be the most important realm of all, because it is in the dream realm that you actually create the narrative. And what we are up against is a crumbling narrative that's filled with falsehood. And what Paul and I have experienced is the real power of connecting to the authentic narrative. That's what the voice represents, our own personal narrative of explaining to ourselves how we crossed over from the geopolitics and the fact-based into this other realm and discovered another way of understanding what was really going on in the geopolitics, not just only in our personal lives.
Which I guess like loops sort of back into this weird, the battle of narratives and the battle of ideologies and dreams of the Neocon cult it's kind of its own reality field. It's not fact based. It's kind of it's a cult. It's a
Well, beliefs are really about beliefs. In fact, you don't have to necessarily have facts to believe that something's real for you.
You don't have to prove.
No, not to yourself. Exactly. And I think that is part of the power of the neocons, that they simply keep believing in what it is they are about. But they have so corrupted the narrative, I don't think they understand that they're beginning to, their belief it will not be enough at some point.
Well, it's certainly, it's not all inclusive, that's for sure. I mean, they've made it pretty clear that we're not included in that narrative. It's their narrative. They're going to create, they are an elite on their own, of their own, for themselves. And they're going to create a world in which they will be happy, I presume, but none of us will be. And that's pretty clear from what you read about Burnham. When you read Burnham's books, when you read what he had to say about it, when he finally analyzed it, when he withdrew from the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party back in 1939, he wrote flat out. He said, I've studied Marxism now for 6-7 years, and I have looked at it, and all I can say is that I don't believe it. I don't believe in Marxism. I believe that there's a managerial elite that's taking over the world, and that the people, they're a class of their own. There's a new class of people, and they're going to take over, and that's what's going to happen. I don't think the future is going to be with socialism. I don't think it's going.
He also didn't believe it was going to be democracy either. It was going to be oligarchy,
or even capitalism for that matter.
Yes, and yet he
was much
totally
more of a feudal relationship.
So here's a man who does not believe, basically, in the possibility of democracy being real. He's totally embraced, in the American system, and heavily influencing things that were done that were very totalitarian.
Yeah,
the things that he basically was promoting.
And it's absolutely
and they were embraced and done.
It's driven our foreign and now very much more so than ever the domestic policy. So again, so tell us more about connecting with what we have a battle of narratives. We live in a world of ideas. The mind is the ultimate battlefield.
Right.
What is the way out of this?
Well, I really think humanity right at this particular moment is threatened as never before. And I mean, all of us as conscious human beings, we're being cornered, we're being told, we're being herded, we're being stopped, we're being frisked at airports, and all of these things. I mean, we witnessed it firsthand, whereby this whole terrorism narrative, the terrorism was being sponsored and still is being sponsored by a lot of these Western nations. NATO itself, I mean, I just read where Trump is, being embraced by NATO, and he's now praising NATO. The fact is that NATO was a force whose whole purpose ended with the end of the Cold War in 1992. It shouldn't exist any longer, and it knows it. There was a Canadian general who was in charge of NATO a few years back, 5 or 6 years ago, who came out and said, this thing is disgusting. He said they're not doing anything. He said they're trying to invent situations whereby they can justify their own existence and continuing on. So that's a good example of it. But the other thing is that I think we are, as I mentioned, we are being threatened by the technology in the hands of an elite few, whether it's the the internet will give you an idea of how life can be changed so quickly and so profoundly. Well, they're now talking, you read scientific journals and they're talking about, well, what exactly does it mean to be human? Now that we don't have to, now that we're not bounded by the, by the fact that we grew up on a farm and we don't have any transportation to get to the local city. Well, I mean, we're so far beyond that at this point that in terms of robotics, in terms of artificial intelligence, and in terms of factories, basically machines making robots.
Well, eventually,
robots making robots.
Eventually, and it'll be, machines basically will start having rights because they're now creating.
That's already been
right, exactly.
That's already in the works.
So you can see that there's constant push to remove people from basically, I consider the human body to be a state, effectively, and what we are living in is a state of our mind. And our mind lives in this body, and our body holds all the senses that allow us to feel connected, to feel a sense of relationship. And it gives us everything we need to know. And that's why when you use all your senses, and that includes the multidimensional, you have the ability to really connect at a very a fundamental level with the meaning and purpose of your life. You'll be sort of living in a constant state of understanding it. What this world has done through the likes of people like Burnham, they have basically gone out of their way to try and sever us from that natural relationship. What we have to do is wake up to that reality. We have to, get beyond the fact that we're all upset that this country and a lot of things we were told about it isn't exactly the way it is. And we have to begin to see what we can do, which is to reassert and basically reclaim the right to our own body and our own ability to use it as our sensing device, which includes everything. I mean, I don't think we just think from our brain. I think we think from our whole body. Every part of our body is involved. And when we connect...
we have a very, what is it? It's a schizophrenic or approach to things. We have a Department of Health, and then we have a Department of Mental Health, and and then 80% of the serotonin, in our brain actually is manufactured in our gut. So
right.
When you talk about our gut is actually a tremendous part of our consciousness.
Exactly. Well, they talk about gut instinct. I mean, that's all part of the language that's telling us. But in terms of what we can do, and what Paul and I experienced was the reclaiming process really has to do with when you basically take charge of your own narrative. The primal thing I think we really have to do now is close out the old narrative, okay? The Grail quest is done, okay? That's what the voice really represents for us. We came to a conclusion, and in that story, we ended the Grail quest for ourselves. Everyone has to do that for themselves, so to speak, because that's been the sort of mythological narrative that we certainly as Americans, especially coming from the British connection, we've all been really, living in this endless cycle of the Grail quest. But when you finally reach a point where you understand that it's really already over, but the formal ending has not been written. So it's kind of languishing, and and they keep trying to resurrect it, but it's over. It's been used up. We have to matriculate, I think is the word I would use here, to another level of mythology and of narrative. And so, but the first thing you have to do is you've got to close out the one you're in. You have to have a ritual with yourself, and you have to say, okay, I'm leaving a stage of my life, and I'm going to go and enter a new stage. It's no different than when you go from childhood to adulthood, that there are certain things you have to let go of. From childhood, I like to describe it this way. With two kinds of people in the world. There are people who believe in Santa Claus, and there are people who are Santa Claus. That's your choice. That's it, okay? And at some point, you have to want to be the giver more than the taker. That's childhood to adulthood. It's that simple. But if you haven't really had enough, if you haven't been satiated enough with something, that can be a difficult journey for some people to make. And that's fine. But at least you have to be conscious of your own experiences and what's stopping you and why you can't move forward. and deal with it as best you can. But in the world we live in today, people have been so disconnected from their own, as I said, you think of your body as your state. When you go around the world, you are a state, literally. Every time you enter another, person's realm, they're a state. So there's a constant interaction that is sort of an equal being to an equal being. And we have completely lost touch with that. Obviously, the nationality should not be separating us that way. It isn't because we have different nationalities or because we have even different belief systems. It's because there is something fundamental about our relationship as humans, as a species, that has been completely obliterated, and we have to bring that back.
And we have to find it again. I mean, we can bring it back, but it's not going to be the same thing we lost.
Right. Exactly.
So we have to come back in a new configuration. And I think that we have the technology, while we have the technology, while we have control of the technology, before it's completely subsumed by this national security craziness, I really think that we have to start really thinking and backing up and thinking in a different way than we have before, and not fall victim to the distractions that are constantly being put out by the media. As I said, as you mentioned, that the stuff with the late night comedy, it's very disturbing because it's more than just vulgar. It's racist and it's abusive. And I'm quite shocked that they have sunk to such a low level. But maybe I shouldn't be shocked. I don't know. But
it's so ideological. It's so propagandistic. It's
totally,
it's
completely.
It's not funny in the least bit. It's just like you're like Hitler screaming at you or something. It's just not good.
I don't think they can possibly even be aware of the fact of how strident in their rhetoric they seem to be.
Yeah.
It's very fascist. It really is. When they, of course, they died probably, with the belief that what they were doing was actually freedom. And that's the irony of this, the whole concept of the mind control has been so effective at convincing this whole layer of artists and authors and journalists that they are the truth, they are the light, and without any perspective whatsoever on what they're really doing.
Well, I think this really is part of the effect of the educational system that's really been set up to separate people from their own internal maturing process and to trust themselves first. Because once you are formed within yourself and have deep trust, that's how you mature into a fully formed adult who is capable of, I think, of using wisdom, of being a mature person. The ones that we're seeing, these they may be in adult bodies, but they're not adult beings. They are very much stuck in some kind of childish, and I use the word childish only in the sense that they didn't mature beyond some childish point. And I think in our last conversation, I made the point about revenge and retribution is a child solution to a very serious problem. And that is not what an adult would do. And we're living obviously with leadership that is basically stuck in very childish ideas of solution. And they seem to, feel that the more severe, the more the more the word punishment. I mean, it makes me really just shudder when I hear the idea of referring to other countries as punishing them. I said, what kind of of adult would use language like that, talking about another nation? It doesn't seem to show any profound understanding of the complexity that we should be approaching the world with.
Well, it's a complete denial of the human rights that that Eleanor Roosevelt, she wrote this charter. It's actually an amazing thing, and we were supposed to be entrusted with or promoting that, and it's absolutely whatever. If we ever were, I don't know, but it's certainly if we were, it's fallen apart.
That, of course, is the one contribution I think that James Burnham made that was really very important was in the delineation between the formal and the real. I mean, in terms of the, and what Eleanor Roosevelt was really speaking is the formal, okay, where it's idealized, it sounds great, but it doesn't seem to get made. And what gets made is the real, okay? And it's what the neocons, it's the kind of presentation the neocons are about. They want to bomb people. They want to control things. They feel they have rights. And we're kind of living in a world where we know that we need to merge these two things. They cannot be separated. The real must become the formal, and the formal must become the real. I like to think of it more in terms of private and public, rather than a formal, which is basically idealized and sounds great, but what is that person really doing? They're not really doing anything to back it up.
Right.
That's part of the problem. And so that is what we've been living in.
That's one of the biggest problems is, the narrative has taken over the imagination completely, and we're not even seeing reality for what it is. And you have things like Operation Iraqi Freedom, and people don't realize that just the extent to which the big lie is just completely running the show. So this probably is a great place to end this talk. We will be talking again, I'm sure, soon. So tell us again the name of the site where we can see your work.
Oh, right. Well, if you can, certainly go to TheSaker. It might still be there, but we have a website. It's
I'll put
called
links up. Yeah.
visiblehistory.com, where we have, the series is posted on there. And we have a lot of other series that we've done earlier than that people might be interested in reading too. And, we'd love people to get in touch with us and let us know what they think.
We're trying to establish a bottom line from people so that people can actually look at the facts as they occur. There are links in the articles, and I think they'll be very helpful.
It's always great to speak with you. I love you guys and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Same
Thank
here.
you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.